Right. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Karen Scapinato. I work in the Division of Research at Florida Atlantic University. Welcome to our very first virtual Research in Action series. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few logistics. Since we have over 100 attendees logged in, we will not allow audio questions. So if you have questions for our presenter today, if you hover your mouse in the bottom window of your Zoom, you see a question and answer, a Q&A button. If you click that, you can type your question there at the end of the talk. We have left sufficient time for you to get your answers to your question. With that, I'd like to introduce our today's speaker, which is Dr. Jeanette Wyneken. Dr. Jeanette Wyneken is Professor of Biological Sciences at Florida Atlantic University. She received her Ph.D. in biology from the University of Illinois. She has more than 30 years of experience working as a biologist, in particular with reptiles. She has over 60 peer-reviewed publications and 25 book chapters. She works very closely with a large number of students on campus and has a lab at Gumbo, Limbo. If you have not been there, please visit. And today's talk will focus on her favorite topic, sea turtles, and how temperature and water affects our sea turtles here on the coast of Florida. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Wyneken.
Okay. So I need my the host to let me start my video. All right, I am now allowed to start my video, so hopefully we are ready. Do you all see a screen with my slide? I hope. Somebody please tell me, because I'm just getting a list of questions rather than. Yes, you can see my screen. Great. All right. Start my video. Okay. So I'm delighted to be here. I'd much rather be seeing you in person, but we'll work with this today. I'm going to be going through a number of aspects of the biology of sea turtles as we've studied them here in Florida. And when I say we, I'm talking not only about myself, but my very lucky collaborations with a number of nature centers and the Gumbo Limbo Nature Center and the Loggerhead Marine Life Center, and also over the Sanibel Captiva Foundation. We've been very lucky to work with great different organizations, and also to engage many students. And the work I'm going to talk to you about today is transpired over about 18 years and has involved 9 or 10 graduate students and about 400 undergraduates. So for that, we'll move forward. And for some reason, this is not, there we go. All right, so if you were to go out on a turtle walk at night this time of year through early July, you might come across something like this. This is the front view of a nesting loggerhead turtle with her, her face buried in the sand, and she's in this little pit that she's dug for herself. And then if we were to turn around and look at the other side of the turtle, here would be the back of her shell and her tail.
Jeanette, we cannot see your slides.
Okay, according to this, it says I've shared my slides. Huh. Well, let's back out of this. I'm going to try to escape out. It says I've started video and that I've shared my slides. Do we have that now?
Yep, now we see you. Thanks, Jeanette.
Okay, let's back up. All right, so this is our loggerhead turtle nesting. And so this is, like I say, the front of a turtle. Here's her face, and her shell is covered with sand because she's been digging in the sand and building her nest. If we were to look at the back of the turtle, you'd see her hind flippers and her shell, and here's her tail, and she's laying a clutch of eggs. And so this process takes place every summer along the east coast of the United States, as well as part of the Gulf Coast. And so the eggs are there to incubate. Mom doesn't hang around. She covers them up and leaves. And it's to the environment that these eggs are incubating. And some of them get more wet and more are in areas that are more cloudy. Some are in bright, when I say the eggs, the nest is in bright sun and gets warmer. Some eggs are laid where there's more shade. In coastal Florida, much of that shade is produced by dwellings on the beach, but some of it's natural, and that shade does allow for a variety of temperatures. The eggs really have this kind of optimal range of not too cold and not too hot, in which they incubate, and then the hatchlings typically come out about 45 to 60 days later, depending on how warm the nest incubates. And they are on their own to find the ocean. And they do this by, they come out when the sand gets cool after they've hatched. And that's critical. We all know what it's like to run on sand that's, you're coming out in the middle of the day, it's too hot. And if little turtles came out in the middle of the day, that's a bad problem for them. That they can overheat and die. We don't want that. So anyway, they've evolved to come out in response to cooling sand temperatures. Usually that's night, so most of the time we see them emerging at night. And then they find the ocean by crawling away from tall, dark silhouettes towards land and towards more open, usually, but not always, brighter horizons towards the sea. And that's how they find the ocean. So this is a group of little loggerheads. I'm going to mostly be talking about little loggerhead turtles, although we do get several species here. And this is what they look like when they're coming, when they've just popped up and they're waiting to kind of have the sand fall off of their eyes and before they head out towards the ocean. And this was a daytime emergence. Again, when they come out in response to cooling sand, if we get a heavy rainfall, sometimes we'll see a nest emerge during the day. But in that case, it's not quite as dangerous on the sand because the sand has, by definition, cooled off. Like I say, we have 3 species here. This is the leatherback. These turtles have been nesting since February, and this is the largest of the species. This one down here in the lower left is a loggerhead, and that's one of the most common species here. It's threatened. The leatherback is an endangered species. This is a green turtle. I know it's not green. The adults large juveniles are named for their green fat. They were part of the food industry. And the green turtles undergo quite a bit of change in color. This is a little older green turtle, about 6 months old. And they're out in the open ocean. So these are the 3 species that we work with. This green turtle just went from an endangered status to threatened very recently, and that's because of the change in the populations. They've been growing at great numbers, and that's due to conservation efforts. So to go through a little natural history, for those of you who don't know a lot about sea turtles, when the turtles come into nest, the moms are laying a clutch of, around here, about 105 eggs on average, and they will nest 5 or 6 times, maybe 7 times about every 11 to 13 days, and throughout the summer, and then they leave and they don't come back for a year or 2. It takes a while to build up enough energy to nest. The eggs incubate, as I say, as a function of the environmental temperatures, and eventually we get turtles hatching, and they go out to sea, and they are out to sea for quite a long time. They go out and live in flotsam areas. They get into oceanic currents and cross the Atlantic. The next time they're seen is our loggerheads anyway, is over by the Azores and Canary Islands, and so it's quite a long trip. Looks like it, in general, we think it takes them about around 160 to 260 days, depends on the currents they get in, to reach those other areas which are high in nutrients, which means it's a good place to grow up and feed. But they don't come back until they're large juveniles. When I say large, we're talking about something that's along the lines of a shell length of around 2 feet. And they are feeding up and down our coastline. And the turtles that are here in our winter often will migrate either to the Bahamas or up in the summertime. They'll go come back to Florida or go up along the Carolinas and Virginia and then migrate back south. So we have snowbirds that come south and we have snow turtles that come south for our winter. But they basically are growing up for a number of years, somewhere along the lines of 15 years before they reach puberty. So they're about total of about 25 years old when they go through puberty, and then once they go through puberty, they start reproducing, and we start this whole cycle again. So much of their life is out to sea, and we actually know the most about them during that small amount of time when they're on land. All right, so I often refer to Florida as having the Turtle Coast. The Turtle Coast, of course, is basically all along here and along here where we have high amounts of nesting. About 90% of the US loggerhead turtles hatch in Florida. That's a big deal. That's between 45 and 65,000 nests per year, and somewhere between 4 to 6 million hatchlings per year. So it's a lot of production of turtles. And as a matter of fact, I find this is just the perfect place because our peninsula is shaped like a flipper. So it reminds you that we're the Turtle Coast. And don't worry, this turtle is fine. It's just, I used its photo for the purpose. Anyway, this is a big deal for loggerhead turtles, also for green turtles, and Palm Beach County especially is important for our leatherback turtles. But let's go back to our loggerheads. We know the most about them, in part because they're a threatened species, and we're able to study them more extensively. About 85% of the Atlantic loggerhead turtles hatch in Florida. So, we got 90% of the US production, and about 85% of the loggerheads that are in the Atlantic came from Florida. So what happens in Florida is really a big deal. Florida's coastline is absolutely critical to the survival of loggerhead turtles in the Atlantic Ocean. And that's a big deal. I'd like to highlight one thing really quickly here. When we talk about putting out 4 to 6 million hatchlings, it sounds like a lot. But if you think about 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 5,000 hatchlings surviving to adulthood, it's not that many. And most of the others are food for other things, like our tarpon and our snappers and fish, a lot of fish, sometimes squid, and offshore billfish and mahi and things like that. All right, so let's talk about our little loggerheads a little bit more. This is one of the turtles that we worked with last summer, and this is in the background. You'll see some turtle nests with this orange tape around it. I want to talk a lot about our role in studying these animals. When I say the future of sea turtles is in our hands, it is not just literally in our hands, although that's certainly one of the things we do. Is here we were moving a nest that was going to wash out to sea. It was one of our study nests. As I'd like to remind you, all these students are part of our team. This student came back to FAU after a year away and just finished his Ph.D. this year. So all of these students have, in one way or the other, joined the scientific community based on the experience they've had working with us. But here I'm teaching them, this is me in an earlier year, teaching them about how to safely move a nest. And that's a a big deal. All right, let's see if we can get this going here. So we all know something about climate change, and I'm going to talk about it in the context of turtles. So we have we know climate change threatens our global conditions. Global is an important word there. You might find, if you're talking to your friends up north, they may be complaining about the cold temperatures in New York right now, but we're not having those here. Globally is how we tend to characterize things. Nevertheless, we see our weather being affected. And I'm going to be talking about two components of the weather that affect sea turtles, temperature and precipitation. And particularly the total precipitation and its severity have a big impact on the outcome for turtle nests. And so that's a part of our concern. I know sea level rise often is discussed. I'm not going to get into that today. All right, but I am going to get into temperature, and particularly I'm going to talk about temperature-dependent sex determination in turtles. They don't have an X chromosome or a Y chromosome, so they're not like mammals. They have environmentally determined sex. So the egg, when it's laid, is not a male or female. It is actually the environment of the nest that determines whether the egg will become female, which happens at the warmer temperatures, or whether it'll become male, which happens at the less warm temperatures. And so that's important. In Florida, where we've been monitoring this, what we're finding is more and more and more females because our nests are getting warmer and warmer. And that's a concern because, as I mentioned, we have both endangered species here and threatened species. And that means we need to correct the problems that have led to a problem in production. One of the concerns has been, do we have enough of both sexes? All right, so we started off this work by not only measuring incubation temperatures. This is a turtle nest where we're placing a temperature data logger. This is a clutch of eggs where we've pulled the top eggs out, and we put this temperature logger down in the nest. This little piece right here is where the sensor is. All the rest of this is just for communication with our computer. And we leave these the whole time the nest is incubating. We record our nest temperatures every 30 minutes. And the nests are instrumented, which means they have that temperature logger in them across the full season. So we're sampling from the beginning of the nesting season to the end of it. And that's a very powerful data set we've been sharing widely with collaborators throughout the world to help understand how nests perform. Okay, so I want to talk to you a little bit about what we've been finding. This is not as scary a graph as you might think. Here on this vertical axis, we have percent female production. These are the years on the y-axis, or excuse me, the x-axis, which is the horizontal axis. The years in which we have been collecting data, and the bars are the percentage of females turtles that we found. So you see that yellow line cutting across the middle there? That's if we had a 50-50 sex ratio, the bars would end at that yellow line. Obviously, if we don't have a 50-50 sex ratio, everything is above that. So the first thing we've learned is that the population is highly female biased. That's what our loggerhead hatchling production is. Now, the second thing I want you to notice is that most of the bars are in fact above 80%. Many of them are above 90%. And we have in this particular graph, 7 bars that are 100% female production. In 2019, which is not on this graph, we had 100% female production. So that's not a good sign. It tells you that our warming nests are having more and more of an impact on the sex ratio. We do have a few years that are labeled as normal. These, by the way, these designations of normal are from the National Weather Service. What's normal for our season. And this is important that it's not, normal has not been very common. When we have a normal year, we don't see as skewed a sex ratio. These little bright suns are telling you that those are years that were designated by the National Weather Service as hotter than normal. And 2015, 2016, and 2017 set records. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. And then these little rain clouds are telling you those are years that were wetter than normal. And if the rain clouds are down low, we had a lot of rain early. And if the rain clouds are at the top, we had a lot of rain late, as in hurricanes or tropical storms. And that can moderate, rainfall can and does moderate the sex ratio, so we get some male production. So that's what we're finding then overall is that there's loggerhead hatchling sex ratios are highly female biased, and that hot and dry conditions are skewing the sex ratio more and more to female. So let's look at a little emergence for those of you who've not seen this before. I'm hoping this will play. It played earlier today. This is a nest that was on a hot year, and that's why it's emerging during the day. These are little loggerheads coming out, and some of them are having a little trouble finding the ocean. Again, this is in part because it was a super hot year, and they were not able to fully orient. They actually are, the heat causes some anomalies in their abilities. So, remember we were measuring those temperatures. Now the temperatures have negative effects not only on behavior, but also on development. So here we have temperatures, and for those of you who are not familiar with degrees centigrade, our body temperature, which should be around 37, and if you were sitting in a room at 28, you'd probably be comfortable. And what this graph is going to show you is what the temperature did during incubation of and this is just a nest that I took an example from. We have many thousands, not thousands, hundreds of these data plots. All right, so we're going to pay attention to a particular kind of temperature, and that's what's called the thermal maximum. And at that point, above that, we start to get birth defects, we start to get developmental problems, and egg death. So in this case, the thermal maximum is basically, defined as when development is compromised. And again, that's because the eggs are totally dependent on the environment of the nest. So let's take one of these for a loggerhead. This line here is our temperature trace from that temperature logger we put in the nest. The up and down is day and night. So there's a little day and night. The big dips are from rainstorms, and the big jumps are from really hot, heating up. And again, this is a normal nest would be somewhere around 32 at max. And we're seeing more and more, 33, 34. And in fact, this nest spent a lot of time over that thermal maximum, so we expect some problems. And in fact, 47 days of its incubation were above the thermal maximum, and it only had a 6.5% hatching success. This is a big deal because normally our hatching success is somewhere around 78 to 81%. This is one example from 2016 when we had very, very record high temperatures, and we had many nests like that. So our populations may experience increased mortality and reduced hatchling production. So this is a problem for us as the weather warms and the climate warms. Just to tell you how we get this information, we inventory nests. When I say we, it's not just me. All over the state, nests are inventoried after the hatchlings have emerged. And usually you find a few hatchlings left in the nest and a few unhatched eggs. And here we have, these are groups of 10 hatched egg shells and a couple of dead eggs here. That's normal. So very few dead eggs, lots of eggshells. That's normal. But on a hot year, we get many, many, many dead eggs. These are not hatched. A few eggshells, so very few hatchlings. And it's really rough on the turtles. It's rough on the people working on them. So these extreme temperatures, and if it's combined with drought or low moisture, basically are reducing embryonic survival. So we learned a lot about this in that 2015 through 2017 period. And so we have our last little bit here is I'm going to talk a little bit about the effects of severe precipitation. So being drought is not good. Having too much going on with our temperature isn't good. And this is what happens when the nest is awash after a nest. These are all nests, and they're all awash after the storms come through. We have drowned nests, or we can have nests that actually wash out. And these are a clutch of eggs that are washing out, and neither is good. Now, we'll talk a little bit about how this impacts the different species. This is a leatherback. They have really long hind limbs. That's about a 7-foot long turtle. I'm 5'8", so that's me with that leatherback turtle. Leatherback turtles lay nests that are deep, and as a result, this is a leatherback nest. It's cooler. And so we find that some of the species are able to survive that. In summary, Florida sea turtles need incubation conditions that are not too hot, not too dry for too long. Hot, dry conditions decrease egg survival and increase developmental defects, rather. Hatchlings from hot nests may not emerge safely. And there are multiple effects of extreme weather on hatchling quality, and it further skews our sex ratios to more females. And finally, rainfall may buffer high temperature effects and increase embryo survival, but the timing of that rainfall matters. And finally, I want to thank the many undergraduate and graduate students, many anonymous donors to the Nelligan Sea Turtle Support Fund, which has supported a lot of this work, as well as the Ashwaubenon family, National Save the Sea Turtle Foundation, for Ocean, who are a company formed by FAU grads, and several different organizations and our partners. And I will be happy to take questions at this point. And I also welcome you to the Marine Lab once we reopen. Come see our turtles and what we've been doing and talk to us. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Wyneken. If you haven't heard it before, if you would like to pose a question, please use the Q&A button in the bottom of your screen and type your question there. I will go down the line basically and post the questions to Dr. Wyneken. So the first one I think was answered, which was, is there a relationship between nest temperature and sex? And you basically answered that, Dr. Wyneken, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So yeah, basically we describe it as hot chicks, cool dudes. So the warmer temperatures produce females, and males are produced at the less warm temperatures.
The next question is, there were some early nests of leatherbacks in February on Hutchinson Island.
Yep.
Other places this year. How many males would you expect to come out of these nests?
Really good question. I would say we've worked with leatherbacks. They are harder to sex than other species. And so we don't know as much about the leatherbacks as others. I would say, except for this year, we would expect more males from those early nests. They often incubate longer because they're cooler. We have had so many warm nights this year. I'm not sure that we're going to get as a high proportion of males. Last year, the leatherbacks started a little later. And we did look at sex ratios in leatherbacks, and we saw 100% females. And last spring wasn't as warm as this spring. So I'm a little cautious about this year.
Great, thank you. The next question is related to your sex ratio graph, and the question is, how many sample nests does the sex ratio graph represent?
So we take samples from 12 nests per species per season. So it'll be 4 nests early season, for middle season, for late season. And that's basically, we figured out what our distribution of nesting was, as well as our distribution of hatching, to make those designations for early and middle and late. Because we wanted to capture the, cool early, warmer, cool to warmer, warm throughout, and then warm then cooling. Although I have to say we're seeing less cooling. So we've been doing that the number of turtles involved is a little over 5,000. And so that's about 120 a year. Occasionally we'll get fewer, bad things happen, like when hurricanes come through, sometimes our nests are washed out and we don't get a sex ratio. So the lowest number, I think, was one year we had 72 or something along those lines. Every once in a while the public lets our turtles go too, but they're not supposed to, but it happens. So that's the joys of working on an urban beach.
Great, thank you. The next question is, in a perfect world, what is the lifespan of the loggerhead?
In case of loggerheads and probably green turtles, it's sort of like us. If we didn't have medical interventions in our lives, we'd probably live to be around 70 or so, 65 to 75, somewhere in that range. Turtles don't, with the exception of those that go into the rehab centers, they don't have that long, they probably have something along those lines. But I would say on average, it's probably more along the lines of 40 to 45. And that's because bad things happen. Fish nets accidentally catch them, or accidentally caught on fishing gear. They're accidentally hit by boats, and there are places in the world where people still depend on them for food. So there aren't that many big predators that can take an adult. Tiger sharks, yes. Some toothed whales, yes, but mostly it's intervention by us.
Great, thank you. The next question is actually related on how to mitigate impacts. It is, how are you mitigating adverse environmental impacts?
Well, the first thing we're doing is trying to educate everybody. It's kind of daunting to deal with a global problem, but this is something that's everybody's responsibility here and abroad. So part of it is reducing our footprint of what's causing these rapid changes in temperature. In the meantime, the other part of the story is that, besides teaching and, demonstrating how, what I do for reducing my impact is, we do know what we can do if we have to. And when I say what we can do when we have to, part of that is a regulatory decision. But I did have a Ph.D. student who worked on the impact of watering. Not because we were looking at it as a mitigation tool, but it's because we were trying to understand what water was doing and why. We actually had some warm nests produce males, and we were trying to figure out why. And it turns out that when the eggs get a lot of water, they don't really cool. The eggs themselves, the clutch itself doesn't cool down, but the individual eggs cool down. They actually sweat. So they take in the water and then give it off. And when they give it off, they're releasing some heat, just sort of like we do when we sweat. And that cools the embryo, which produced some of the males. And that was Alex Lolovar's part of her Ph.D. Now, the consequence of doing that study was we do understand how to cool off the nest if it's not too hot and not too dry, if we are really bumping up a problem with not enough males. It's not my decision. It's a decision that's made by the regulatory agencies, but we do have that technology now. Tool in our toolbox.
Great, thank you.
Somebody sees what is a drowned nest? Yeah, that's, I mean, just like, you don't think about eggs under the sand breathing, but those embryos are using oxygen. And so they need to be able to take in oxygen and, and release carbon dioxide. So air, even air in sand, is about 21% oxygen. And when the water covers the nest, it totally fills the air spaces with water. Water has a fraction of the oxygen in it that air does, and so it drowns the eggs, just like, if you were to go in and take a big inhalation of water, it wouldn't turn out so well.
All right, the next question is related to the temperature of the nest. Do the turtles always get back to the same beach that they hatched themselves from, or is there potential that they could move further north as the weather gets warmer?
Really good question. It's an hot area of research. So let me first deal with the turtles come back to their same natal region. So, for example, a turtle that hatches in Boca Raton might come back to Boca Raton, or it might come back to Hutchinson Island, or it might go to Miami, or it might even go over to Sarasota. Yeah, they basically are using magnetic information from the Earth from the Earth's magnetic field to identify what's comparable to latitude. And then when they come back to the same region, they blunder into the same general latitude. So they're coming back to the same region, but not necessarily to the same beach. And if you think about it, beaches are pretty dynamic, and if we weren't out there replacing them with pumped sand or trucked sand, probably some of these beaches that they hatched on wouldn't even be there. So the turtles that came back to the exact same spot probably would have a poor survival choice. So they have to be a little bit sloppy, and sloppy in this case of finding where you came from is good. The potential to move north is a really good question. These animals have been around for, in the case of loggerheads, around 60 million years. And that means they've gone through some periods when there was no peninsular Florida, or very little of it. And then there was peninsular Florida. And, so beaches, they live in a very dynamic area, world. So that means that they have to be able to move. But what we are not seeing is a big increase in shifting northwards. There's slight hint that the leatherbacks might be shifting north, a little bit north, but not enough, not far enough north to make a difference yet. And I'm very cautious about that leatherback story as it is, because it's really hard to study that particular species. So yeah, I would say probably they have the potential, but we're not seeing evidence of it at this point.
Great, thank you. The next question is related to why you're compelled to study sea turtles.
Oh gosh, well, they're cool, they're interesting. There's enough questions there for my entire career, and then an entire career of another 300 to 400 scientists. It's just they're absolutely fascinating. They're one of the times when you go out on the beach and see a nesting turtle. These are like, turtles as a group have been around for about 100 and sea turtles have been around for about 110 million years. So you're sort of like hanging out with dinosaurs, and that's every kid 3 to 4 or 5 years old wanted dinosaurs, right? So my fascination started with my toy dinosaurs, and when I told my mom I wanted a pet dinosaur, she says, that's not going to happen. How about a turtle? And so I got started with pet turtles, and became that geeky kid that snuck into the adult section of the library to read more and more. And the turtles and the reptiles in general have been fascinating because of toy dinosaurs. And as I became more of a scientist, I really became fascinated by what can science do to help.
The next question is related to intervention again. I think you already answered some of this, but do you have any interventions by removing eggs and putting them into a controlled environment?
It certainly is a technique. It's used elsewhere in the world. We do a small amount of that, not for conservation interventions, but to understand what different kinds of impacts are. And sometimes we have to control one factor, and to control one factor, you then have to control another factor as you manipulate things. So that's what we know how to raise them in captivity if we have to. But there's I guess a bit of an ethical question here, which is if the turtles become totally conservation or manipulation dependent, all you're doing is perpetuating turtles and putting them back into a world where they themselves cannot produce offspring that will survive without intervention. So it's, these animals occur globally from basically the temperate, subtemperate, temperate to subtropical and tropical regions around the world. And we can't fix all of those locally. There are different projects in Malaysia and in Indonesia, and I think mostly Indonesia and Malaysia, where there's actual intervention. And that intervention wasn't because of the temperature, it was because of poachers. And people were collecting all the eggs and eating all the eggs. And if you do that, no return on your deposit, so to speak. So the eggs were being protected in hatcheries, and then they realized they were producing, their hatcheries were basically, think of like a garden plot with a bunch of stakes, and you're screening to protect your tomato plant. Think of something along those lines on a large, about the size of a basketball court. And then they realized they were producing all females because they were out in the sun. So then they put shade screen and sprinklers in. And so the Malaysians were actually very proactive. They've been doing this for about 30 years in dealing with this. But part of the reason they were so proactive was they were one of the first organizations or first countries to have organization to protect eggs from poachers. And they did it by putting them in the middle of the beach, and which is the hottest part. So anyway, there are places in the world that do this. And like I say, it didn't come from trying to control temperature. It came from poaching, protection from poaching.
What percentage of total nests are being studied?
What percentage? Oh, a small percentage. So let's see, I think I told you there were about 45 to 65,000 nests, and we work with 12 loggerheads a year. And when I have a graduate student working, we might be working with 36. So it's a very small fraction. And that, other organizations are studying nests, but I would say all told, we're looking at probably under 100 nests a year.
Great. All right, we already answered how long sea turtles live. You said about an average of 40 years. So the next question is, we found your steaks after breaking. Where do you return them?
You could drop them off at Gumbo Limbo. That would be great. They're, like I say, a wonderful partner for us. And I realize Gumbo Limbo's closed, but there's a big plastic chest out front for mail, and you can just put them on top of that, and we'll put them back. Thank you.
Related to that, are you allowed to remove eggs from the nest if there's a large storm?
If there's a large storm, you got to keep in mind that these animals have they've evolved in a very dynamic environment, which includes hurricanes. And as remember, I told you that a female nests, somewhere between 5 and 6 or 7 times in a season, and she comes back every couple of years. That means that, let's say a female is putting out, we'll round that off and say, let's say she's putting out 600 eggs in a season. If half of her nests were destroyed, she'd still have somewhere along the lines of 300 eggs incubating. And out of that 300 eggs, unless it's a super hot year, she's probably going to put out, somewhere along the lines of, if she had a 70, let's say it was on the low side and a 70% hatching success, 210 hatchlings. So she's not completely out of her reproductive success. Now, I will periodically request permission to move our study nests, because we've been very, if it's the period of time in which the sex is determined of those eggs is in the middle third of incubation. And after the middle third of incubation, it really doesn't matter what the temperature is. Well, let me rephrase that. As long as it's in not above the thermal maximum, it doesn't matter what the temperature is. And I occasionally am able to get permission to move nests out of harm's way so that we can finish collecting that season's data. If we have nests that are, like last year, we had some nests that were just still too early in development. The embryo is actually attached to the side of the eggshell, and moving them is often lethal. So we don't move nests that we don't have to. And I always have to tell, in order to do this work, I have to get state permission. And I always have to tell them which nests I'm moving, why I'm moving them, and then it's a request permission to do that. And it's not minor. It's also not minor to take care of those eggs once they're in the lab. It's, you have to go in a couple times a day and check to make sure that if they start hatching, you don't think about it, but the egg's full of albumin as well as embryo. And if you don't stay on top of that, you get kind of a lot of mess. And it's hard on the embryos. They're hard on the hatchlings as well. So we don't. It's a lot of work to do it safely.
Great.
Try not to do that to myself unless I have to.
We have a lot more questions, and I feel we're not going to get to everybody. If we happen not to get to your question, we'll put a blog or a question answer on our website and then answer some of your questions there. But we have another 10 minutes left. The next question is, how does the increased amount of females born impact the opportunities for finding male mates? Can one male mate with multiple females?
Yes, one male can mate with multiple females, and that's the good news. The concern. So right now, if you think about it, because we're seeing enough fertilized eggs, we're not seeing a problem yet. It'll probably be outside of my lifespan when the impact of this is seen. And so, part of our obligation is not just what's happening now. It's, making sure there are enough males for the future. We used to think that the turtle nests farther north were producing the males. And when I first started doing this, we actually sampled nests from North Carolina all the way through the Carolinas and Georgia and northern Florida and around the peninsula to the south. That was an insane amount of work. But what we found was, of course, everybody was thinking, well, the northern nests are north, they're cooler, therefore they're producing hatchlings that are males. But it wasn't that simple. The turtles are still nesting in the summer, and it doesn't matter whether it's a Georgia summer or a Carolina summer. Hot is hot. It ended up being that, if we had enough rainfall, enough cloudy days here in Florida, then we got enough males that actually outnumbered the number produced in that upper 10% of the production. But so that's it's a good question though.
I have the next one is a completely different question related to the FAU Marine Lab. How old do you have to be to volunteer there?
Well, at the FAU Marine Lab, I don't take volunteers. I take university students because that's my obligation as a faculty member. The Gumbo Limbo Nature Center takes volunteers. I think they have to be 16. I'm not positive. I would refer you to the Gumbo Limbo Nature Center. Their components. but I do work extensively with college students and graduate students. So my college students, the youngest ones, I think are 18. And, part of that is, so that they can work on their own unsupervised and that they have the basic background, because we are doing research as opposed to just taking care of turtles.
Great. During excessively hot years with minimal rain, would it make sense to erect tent covers to cool the nest somewhat and make it easier on the boys?
Really good question. So we actually accidentally did that experiment. We weren't intending to, but we were trying to cool some nests enough in a hot year to look at just the impact of water, and it was so hot that we put shade cloth over several nests. And what we found out was, there's the sand around is just so hot that it radiates heat from the sides, from the dune, and hot is hot. It doesn't matter if you're in the shade or not. So that's a problem. It works in hatcheries where they can control the shade and control the amount of space. And I think in Malaysia they were using some 80% shade cloth and some 60% shade cloth, and then they had to, when it was getting too hot, they also were turning their sprinklers on. So it's like I say, it's been done elsewhere. But they're also, and one of the things you don't think about is if you put something on the beach, you don't always think that the adults or the females who are coming in to nest at night might run into it and get entangled. And so there's a lot of restrictions on what we can put on the beach. Every year there's turtles that get caught up in beach chairs and die from heat stroke because they get a nesting turtle. You think something that's that old and 300 pounds wouldn't have that problem, but they do. So there's a lot of restrictions on what we can put on the beach.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more question. Again, if you don't see your question answered, please still post it. We will follow up online with a question and answer session to answer all your questions. So the last one for today is, you briefly mentioned the defects in the hatchlings. Can you describe these defects?
Sure. So there's things that are thermal injuries. So one of the things that happens with turtles that incubate too hot is they often will have a thermal injury of the eyeball, and they actually bleed into the outer part of their eyeball, and it blocks their vision. We know that this will recover because we've had some of our study animals come in that way, and it takes about 2 to 3 weeks to recover. But of course, the ones if they're getting out to sea, if their vision isn't fully blocked, they still will have trouble finding food for a while, and that's a problem. We also see an increase in just the plates on the shell are in a specific pattern. So 5 on the side and 5 down the middle and 11 on the sides, and that gets all kind of staggered, and that turns out that pattern is partially driven by some heat-sensitive genes. And it turns out those same heat-sensitive genes are defining how the gastrointestinal system develops. So we're starting to investigate that. We also see a kind of injury that if the turtles are coming to the surface and it's been so hot and we have hot nights, then the sand doesn't really cool down until morning. And so those turtles that are coming out in the morning are often have been so hot so long that they have a yolk sac that's internalized, and that yolk sac is we call it denatured. It looks like somebody cooked the yolk, and those turtles cannot access that yolk, and it's a problem. It's a real problem. It kills them.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wyneken. We will end the question and answer session here. I want to remind everybody on the call that this is going to be a weekly event. Next week, Dr. Michael DeDono will talk about the male versus the female brain, which I think will be very interesting. I also want to mention that there is a new website that lists all of the virtual presentations that FAU has to offer, which is called Let's Talk Research. You go to fau.edu/research, type in Let's Talk Research. You should find that under our community button. And with that, I appreciate your attendance and look forward to having you participate in another session. Have a good afternoon.
Okay. I look forward to answering these questions online. It looks like there's quite a few still. Wow, there's quite a few, including former students. Great. Thanks all.